The title of the talk is The Irish Migration Since Kinsale. And of course, Kinsale was the famous battle there in 1601, which saw the defeat of the local chieftain from Dungannon here, Hugh O'Neill, and the Irish by the forces of the English crown. So it is, like a lot of other events in Irish history, a watershed in that it changed events afterwards and had consequences which even then were unseen and even yet are still being rationalized and analyzed. I think that we start there because prior to that, there wasn't a lot of movement of people. And we choose the word migration, and it's probably better to start defining what migration means. It actually means the movement of people, whether that be into the country, out of the country, or within the country. And of course, I'd never given it an awful lot of thought until I was speaking recently to a colleague, a friend of a friend, if you like, who happens to be a professor of history in the University of Maynooth near Dublin. And he explained to me about the origins of my own family name, which in English is Holland, but in Irish is O'Halloran. And that branch of the family apparently were from the Irish Midlands, counties Offaly and Laois. And they were a subsept in the same way that the Quins, O'Hagans and Dethlins and so on were subsepts of the O'Neills. They were subsepts of the O'Carrolls and the O'Moores in that part of the Ireland. They were the O'Moores and the O'Carrolls were invited to a tete-a-tete, shall we say? Well, that's what they thought it was. So they went for this powwow to a place called Mullaghmast in County Kildare. The English invited them there, and when they turned up, they actually massacred the whole lot of them, almost 100 people. So that sort of lopped off the local leadership of the Irish community in that area. And the O'Hallorans knew that their goose was cooked and it was time to get out of town. So prior to that event, O'Neill had been down there garnering support for his plans to get rid of the English. So they came north to Dungannon seeking his protection. And I thought that as a bit of a strange story, but on researching it, I found on the Hearth Money Roll 60 years later, 3 O'Neill families within the shadows of O'Neill's castle, just outside Dungannon, in the townlands of Coche and Killyneal. I can't remember what the other one was, but Lisnadlin were 3 families of O'Hallorans. So that's internal migration, and that's before Kinsale. So that probably was replicated more often than we think, with different families having different reasons to move around because of the particular political situation that was at that time, who was calling the shots and who wasn't. So if we move on after that, now that we have an understanding what migration is all about, so the island of Ireland has experienced the greatest per capita movement of people of any country in Europe over the past 5 centuries. That's an extraordinary claim to make, but it is an actual fact. And I'm thanking Paddy Fitzgerald and his colleague in their book on Irish migration for that figure. And it many different causes and can be obviously categorized, as I just explained, as internal, inward, and external migration. And as we'll see later on, the numbers are actually staggering. We're talking millions of people. So there we have the definition of migration, and the age of European colonialism has led to an accelerated pace of migration since early modern times in the 16th century. 240,000 Europeans entered American ports. In the 19th century, over 50 million people left Europe for America alone. That's a staggering figure of people, 50 million. The local population, or the native population, such as the Aboriginal people in Australia and Argentina and so on and so forth, and the United States, Native Americans, were often overwhelmed by these incoming settlers. And those settlers also brought with them indentured workers and imported slaves. Indentured workers were a fancy name for slaves, really. Okay, so here we have these maps show you the inward migration or known migration begins after the English expand their influence in the 16th century. And this is where, going back to my own family history, this is a reflection of it. And those you'll have to help me here, Jonathan. The color codes for the different parts of it, can you explain them, please?
Basically, the situation left-hand map is the earliest sort of plantation. The yellow area in northeast Ulster is the Scottish plantation through McDonald, Earls of Antrim, and the other plantations in the Midlands and down in the southwest were primarily of English settlers. So this was basically breaking out from the Pale and Dublin during the reign of Elizabeth I to try and colonise Ireland in a more expansive way. And then the right-hand map is the plantation, sort of as we begin to understand it, will occur after, and the right-hand map is really...
I'm afraid we can't hear Jonathan.
Oh, right, sorry. Hold on a wee second. You'll hear me now. So basically, the right-hand map is the routes taken in the war between Hugh O'Neill and the forces of the Crown, Elizabeth I. And it's really, as Brendan had said earlier, after the fall of Kinsale in 1602-3, paves the way for a full-blown plantation, which of course is the plantation of Ulster. But you have to be aware that there were plantations in Ireland before that time. But it's Hugh's defeat that brings that about. The flight of the Earls, 1607, removes any realistic resistance to an expansion and a more formalised settlement that would come about the Ulster plantation. So that's really those two maps are explaining. So left hand is the Elizabethan period, and the right hand is the campaign between Hugh O'Neill and the English Crown forces in the early 1600s. So just further explaining the maps. The left-hand one is the Ulster plantation as we understand it. So Antrim had already taken place as a private plantation through the Earl of Antrim, as he would become, MacDonald, who was actually a Scots, probably originally Irish Gaelic from the 6th century. It's one of the weird, unusual links between Scotland and Ulster, is you've this constant migration back and forth since at least the 6th century and probably long before that. And then in the right-hand map, we see the plantations sort of combined between the Ulster plantation, confined basically to Ulster, and then the older plantations that were already established prior to 1600. So the colour coding on the left-hand map of the Ulster plantation is based on where land was granted to Scottish settlers, granted to English / Welsh settlers, and then the other colour code was what was referred to as natives. And what they were predominantly Irish clan chieftains, or sort of the next line down in rank, who had taken up arms against Hugh. Really old ancient family rivalries basically was what all that was about. They reckoned that by basically tying their fortunes to the crown, they suspected would be the likely winner, that they would come out better if they did it that way rather than supporting Hugh. And in fact, here where we are in South Tyrone was predominantly settled by it was settled as plantations of native or those Irish chieftains that had taken up arms with the crown against you. Whereas in a lot of other places, they're just your settlements. Antrim was already settled privately, as I said, mainly with Scots. County Down was a joint private colonisation through the Montgomerys and through Hamilton. That was in 1606. So that's why it's sort of slightly separate there to the eastern province. So then there are further sort of plantations. The right-hand map takes us up right up to 1620. So it's a hectic period of activity that's really only possible because of the defeat of Hugh O'Neill. If that had not happened or had been significantly delayed to the point where the crown sort of, if you like, lost interest, the Ulster plantation probably couldn't have happened. It was his removal and O'Donnell's removal with the flight that really made all that possible. Because if anything had been learned in campaigns by Crown forces in Ireland, it was very, very difficult to win an outright victory. Terrain didn't suit, the style of fighting didn't suit. You know, sort of open battlefield confrontations. There was no... Britain, as you know, had been colonized by the Romans, who had built roads extensively up and down the length of Britain. Ireland had nothing like that. So it was very hard to move large mobilized forces over long distances in Ireland. That made it very difficult for a conventional army, no matter how it was armed, to win outright victories in large scales. I mean, Ben Barb's probably about the closest we ever got to something that even came close to a large battle at that time period, and might never have happened. It's just one of those things.
Okay. The map on the left, those blue areas are areas which are settled by English servitors. And those are areas even today that you'll find the Church of Ireland is more prominent. Fermanagh being case in point. In fact, Patricia and I have a daughter-in-law who's Church of Ireland stock. Her maiden name was Lucy. So that tells you that the settlement that took place then of English servitors has actually worked its way out into the 21st century. The yellow ones, the Presbyterians, they came in small quantities, but as we'll find out later on, they came in larger quantities much later than the original plantation. Okay, Jonathan. So the 1641 rebellion, for those who are not familiar with Irish history, was a rebellion by, if you like, the remaining Irish clan chieftains who discovered to their cost that they were losing land because of, I suppose, greed on the part of the English and ignorance on the part of the Irish, how the entitlement was given to people on land. The Irish had a different system of land ownership than the English, but the English was through deeds and titles, which a lot of the Irish didn't fully comprehend. So they thought, right, let's get rid of this lot, and they rebelled. And actually, they were on the verge of actually expelling most of the English out of Ireland. But eventually, the arrival of the Cromwell, who won the Civil War in England in 1649 into Ireland, he put the rebellion down. So you had this confederacy reigning in Ireland from 1641 to 1649, which it's hard to believe, really, but it did mean that a lot of people actually migrated back to England and to Scotland and Wales because they were afraid. They literally ran for their lives. You know, that's something that perhaps we don't appreciate, that migration isn't always immigration or emigration. It can be a mixture of both, you know. Okay. That 1641 period, then the cream of Irish society really went abroad. They were known as the Flight of the Wild Geese. So you had all these soldiers who joined armies in Spain and in Belgium, today's Belgium, and also in France, and so on and so forth. So they were. It was known as the Flight of the Wild Geese, and someone rather cynically called it it was the Wild Ganders. Of course, they were all men. But anyway, we need sometimes to inject a little bit of humor into these very heavy conversations. So after Cromwell, of course, he was succeeded in England by Charles II, and he had this Act of Settlement, which led to another plantation. That then was the first real serious attempt at trying to make Ireland subservient to the English crown. So one of the consequences of the rebellion was that a number of Irish families who may or may not have taken part in the rebellion, but they reckon up to 50,000 of them, which in that period of time, 50,000 was a huge proportion of the population, which we think at this time wasn't much more than 1 million people. So we're talking about 2% of the Irish population were transported to America and the West Indies. And that lady that a lot of our younger members would be familiar with, and some of our older members too, Rihanna is a descendant of an Irish settler in Barbados. There is this group of people in Barbados who are descendants of white migrants who were sent there or, in effect, transported there against their will. But they settled in parts of Barbados, and today they're still, if you like, a disenchanted minority because, they've never accepted their new role in that part of the world. So many of them have eschewed education and different things like that, where they could raise themselves up and so on and so forth. So there's a certain amount of negative feelings towards progress. So they live a sort of indolent life, where they're not really that industrious and so on and so forth. And many of these people are descendants of Scottish, Welsh, and Irish people who were sent there by Cromwell. Now, at that particular time, later on in the 17th century, we had what is known as the Edict of Nantes, which was, if you like, a proclamation by Louis the 14th to get rid of Protestantism in France. And one of the largest groups of Protestants in France were the Huguenots. And it meant that a lot of them decided to emigrate, and they went. Some of them went to England, but quite a few of them came to Ireland. And the town of Portarlington in County Laois is a case in point, where there are a lot of Huguenot descendants. And as you can see in the photograph at the bottom right there's a Huguenot cemetery in Dublin, which I presume really it was built for as a cemetery for the original immigrants from France. Yeah. Anyway, we have a list of names here that illustrated the control of the ascendancy. The ascendancy can basically be described as a small group of very influential Anglican clergymen, judges, and politicians and crown-appointed people, administrators, who ruled the country. Now, when power is concentrated in a small number of the hands of a small number of people, you can almost be certain corruption will follow. So they helped themselves to huge acreages of land, much against the wishes of the local natives, and set themselves up as landlords. And by today's standards, the arrogance is actually astounding, because some of them didn't even bother coming to live in Ireland. They were absentee landlords, and they appointed agents who came round and collected the rent. And they allowed a number of people to rent land from them, who in turn re-rented the land to middlemen, who in turn rented it to the local natives. So you had this hierarchy of agents who were playing fast and loose with the plantation, and you can imagine the resentment that would have caused. You didn't have to be educated; you just had to be enough brains to understand that you were being screwed. Simple. So the map on the right is an atlas of Irish history, which explains the displacement of native families, and you can see a trend of moving them south and west. And of course, it also explains why, for example, we get Tyrone names in places like Cork and Mayo, O'Neill's, Devlin's, Quinn's. And they ended up there because that's the edict was to hell or to Connaught. But some of them that ended up in Cork were actually followers of O'Neill right back to the beginning of the 17th century. Thank you, Jonathan. So we move on then to the late 17th century and the early 18th century. And we talked about this movement of people before. What people don't understand is that Ireland was not the only country that suffered from famine. Scotland suffered a dreadful famine in the years 1699 right through to 1705. So bad, in fact, that people died. In Aberdeen, for example, 25% of the population disappeared because the weather, and there were a number of volcanic eruptions and things like that that caused this dreadful famine in Scotland. So a lot of them then decided, again, they were tenants of lairds. So the system that pertained in Ireland was similar to what was pertaining in Scotland. And their lairds sent them to their buddies here, and they took over some land in Ireland, were given some land in Ireland by landlords. And the best example of that locally is that area from here to Carnthill, which today is almost 100% Presbyterian. And those people, in fact, are the descendants of those people who came here because of famine. It's a misunderstood movement of people, that it wasn't a smash and grab arrangement. They were coming to save their own lives, to make a living. So it's as well that we all remember that it's just not the Irish who suffered from famine. Now, after this period of time, the things settled because the authorities had been successful in quelling any local opposition militarily and every other way. So the population then started to improve. And one of the reasons for that was the introduction of the potato from South America. And you can see in this graph here that goes from right back to the year 1200, right through to 2000, the different peaks and troughs in the population. And of course, the major peak was the famine, which we'll talk about later. This was you can see the Cromwellian War that we just talked about. You can see the drop in population there from just under 3 million to 2 million. And then the increase in population virtually non-stop right through to the famine. And that was caused by the adaptability of the potato. It allowed small holdings to harvest enough food for themselves, and then at the same time, they could be usefully employed or gainfully employed in either spinning flax to make linen, or actually making the yarn. So these were cottage industries. So we had literally hundreds of thousands of people with little rooms dedicated to this spinning and making of linen. And they took their linen to the local market, and it was another way of paying off the rent. And then the potato provided them with food. So it was very much a subsistence type existence. No one ever made a lot of money out of it, but they made enough money to live. And as a result of that, the population just exploded. You can see, if you like, if we take a period from 1800, where the population was somewhere between 3 and 4 million, and 40 years later, it's at 8 million. It's doubled. It's actually doubled in 40 years, which by any standards is a phenomenal amount of people. So if we move on, then here we have the first immigration of Palatine people from Lower Germany in the early 1700s. And they came to Ireland again to find religious freedom. Tolerance was a very cheap commodity in these days. If you didn't, if you didn't toe the line, you were in trouble. So you had these groups like the Palatines and the Huguenots who didn't see their salvation in the same way that the authorities of that particular country saw it. So they became enemies of the state, in effect. So they had to up sticks and move. So some of them came to Ireland and settled here in Ireland, and then later on to New York and North Carolina. Okay. So the first significant movement of people out of Ireland were not, strictly speaking, native Irish. They were Scotch Irish, mainly from this part of the world. And there were 5 great waves of immigration from Ulster between 1717 to 18, 1725 to 29, 1740 to 41, 1754 to 55, and 1771 to 75. And most of this was done because of the way in which the ascendancy that I described earlier on treated these people. They weren't of the Anglican persuasion and therefore were seen as a threat. And they were punished for having different beliefs. And as I said before, tolerance was rare currency in these days. So a lot of them actually decided, let's go somewhere where we can practice what we believe in reasonable comfort and get on with life, which explains the movement of people by the Scotch Irish in the mid to late 18th century. And, you know, if we examine some of the trends that they were the pioneers of, they moved into Appalachia and down into through the Shenandoah Valley into Tennessee and Kentucky, and they were largely followers of King William because he was seen by them as the savior of religious freedom. And the term hillbilly that we know and familiar with takes its name from King Billy or King William. They were a significant influence in early American politics. And I want to share a local story with you in that one of those immigrants, or a family of those immigrants, were from the townland of Eskra, which is just literally up the road from here. Then their name was McFarlane. That's McFarlane ending in E. And they emigrated to a place in Pennsylvania just north of Pittsburgh. And they were very independent-minded. And they weren't long there until they decided to join with George Washington and fight for American independence, because they didn't like British rule. They'd seen a bit of it in their own country here in Ireland, and they thought, I'm not having any of that. I'll go to this new world. And when they arrived there, they again were under the control of the British, and they decided to rebel. And they took part. One of them, in fact, was I wouldn't say a friend of George Washington's, but he certainly was an acquaintance of him. And it was a really interesting story because we were contacted by a descendant of these McFarlanes. And this lady, she lives in I think it's Ohio, is it? I'm not sure. And she explained to us that one of the brothers, there were three brothers who all joined up to fight in the War of Independence. And one of them was annoyed because the new administration in Washington decided to tax whiskey producers. And they had two levels of taxation, but the heavier taxation was levied on the smaller producers, of which the McFarlanes were one. So they thought that was unfair, and they rebelled, and they made their feelings known. They went to the governor's mansion, if you like, or whatever it was at the time, and had a demonstration. And the guards there got a bit nervous and shot one of the brothers, and he died as a result. He was shot in the leg, and he bled to death. But on his deathbed, his last words were Oscuelia, were in Gaelic. And that, in many ways, was a surprise to us, but it explains to us why these people that we call strangers actually came. When they came here, they could quite easily converse with locals because they were speaking the same language. Of course, they were from that part of Scotland where Gaelic was still in everyday use. You know, just as an aside, in the way in which the Irish language has been, shall we say, politicized, some shall we say, unionist politicians make a big fuss about the Irish language, but if they really knew their history, it's their language as well. And it's just the way in which they interpret, the way in which they have been asked to absorb it. Anyway, that's another day's work. Okay, so we move on then. This is a report in 1772 from Londonderry, and it explains about anyone who wants to emigrate, how to do it. And if you were, again, making this more local, any person near Kinsale in the county of Tyrone may apply to Mr. Andrew McFarlane of Eskra. Now, where have we heard that name before? And he was, if you like, an agent for the shipping company. And this explains how local immigration works. If you had an agent in your locality, contact him. he tells you how much it's going to cost. In some cases, they actually would provide the funds for that, and then you work it off when you arrive. So that was the way in which the system was set up at the time. And the ship was hourly expected from Cork and will sail near the time, as mentioned, as near as possible. And any person intending to go in her or desire to come in and agree and give, what's that last word, Jonathan? And give earnest, yeah. So this was 1773, and that's 3 years before the American War of Independence began. And one of the men who took part in that was Andrew McFarlane. Thank you, Jonathan. The demand for linen at this period of time, Britain was at war with a number of European countries, mainly France, and the demand for linen went through the roof, literally went through the roof. The army were largely clothed in linen clothes, and therefore these cottage industries that we talked about were working sometimes through the night to produce what was demanded by the market. But of course, all good things come to an end. And when Napoleon was defeated in 1815, the demand for linen dropped like a stone. Akin, if you like, to the property boom of the early 2000 and 2100s, and then you have the recession that follows it. And there was another really important development at this period of time, is that the industry, the linen industry in particular, and then later on the cotton industry, became mechanized. So that, in effect, meant that people who were working in their little cabins or wherever they were working were no longer needed. And that income was no longer available. And as such, they were struggling to pay the rent. Now, I know for a fact that an ancestor of mine, Michael Holland, left Kinsale in 1830, right in the middle of this recession. And in fact, his descendants, probably online tonight, a lady called Jocelyn Letourneur from Montreal. And, it illustrates in real terms where people went. And we understand that in this period, this is the beginning of, if you like, a strong church-backed and landlord-backed movement of people from this country to the New World, mostly to Canada. Because at that period of time, of course, Canada, as we know it today, was known as British North America. So people moved there, and in Michael Holland's family's case, people like them were granted 100 acres, phenomenal amount of land. And his family settled in Ontario, and they were able to, clear the land of deforested and so on and so forth. But just as it's worth pointing out that whilst these people were looking after themselves, at the same time, they were displacing Native Americans. And, it's the old story of empire building. There's always a loser. There's always a winner. And the winner sometimes does take it all, as the song says. This mechanization as well caused a movement of people away from the countryside. So this is where we begin to see the growth of cities like Belfast. And you can see from the the graph on the right, the enormous increase in population year by year in Belfast to nearly 500,000 people. From starting off a little town of 20-odd thousand people. And of course, there were other factors at work because of its natural port. It became a center of shipbuilding. It became a center of the linen industry and cotton as well. So you had this opportunity for employment. So people moved in droves to Belfast, and they moved with their neighbours into ghettos that were built by the city authorities. And those ghettos are still with us today, particularly in West Belfast, where you have people of the Protestant persuasion living cheek by jowl with people of the Catholic persuasion. And, you know, it's a dreadful legacy of that history, that 2 centuries on, these people still haven't learned to live with each other. Again, you can see the number of textile linens and looms in Belfast. You know, again, the numbers just went through the roof, leading to this. It became like a magnet for country people to come and live in. And if you look at some of the names in Belfast, you'll see local Tyrone names in it, even though they've been there for 6, 7 generations. All right, John. So along comes the famine in the middle of all of this, because the one thing that was keeping people alive was the potato. And of course, along came the blight, and that, in effect, had a huge impact on the Irish population. I think in my study of Irish history that this one event is the real watershed in Irish history, because it marks a period where it illustrates a number of things. One, the misgovernance of the country by the English ascendancy. They allowed a famine to develop, while at the same time the country was exporting thousands of tons of food that would have sustained the Irish population. They chose not to, because they had an unhealthy reliance on laissez-faire economics. The Tories today call it market forces. But it's the same thing. People are going hungry. People are not fit to pay their part because of laissez-faire economics. But this was a much greater degree of that at the time. And of course, people emigrated literally in the millions. 2 million people were emigrated between 45 and 50. 5 years. 1/4 of the Irish population emigrated. Now, you imagine that's the equivalent today of 1.75 million leaving the country in 5 years. It's just a phenomenal amount of people. So the population in 1841 was 8.2, and in 1851, 6.6. So you have a reduction there of 1.6 million in such a short period of time. Okay, John. This is a photograph of a deserted village, which Patricia and myself visited 20-odd years ago. It's in Achill Island. And I think it's a perfect image of what the famine did to Ireland. Here you had these people living over 125 houses in a wilderness on Achill Island, with tracks of the potato crops that they were planting still visible. And these people left in their droves to go to the New World. And their houses are still there as, if you like, a lasting legacy of the famine. I think it's an image that very few of us can be comfortable with. It wasn't just the population of Mayo that were affected. This is within an hour's drive from here. This is a place called Galbally, meaning home of the stranger. It's in County Antrim. Again, another deserted village. They're frightening images, really. They just say, we used to live here, but nobody lives here anymore. The Americans have a term called a ghost town. So these are Irish ghost towns. So with this number of people emigrating, you had a number of different immigration points into America. The first of these was Castle Gardens in New York. And prior to that, there was also one in Grosse Ile on the St. Lawrence Seaway near Montreal, where they received the 7.5 million people who arrived in the United States between 1855 and 1890. Just think about that, folks. That's the population of Ireland today. It's an amazing statistic. And here we have Ellis Island on the right and Grosse Ile on the left. And on the bottom left is a memorial to the number of people who died on their way out there, because the famine ships weren't exactly very healthy. Disease was common, diphtheria, airborne diseases. People placed in very close contact with each other obviously disease spreads like wildfire, and people suffer the consequences. Okay. Now, here's another type of immigration, commonly known as transportation. And this is where people convicted of the most minimalist of crimes that you can imagine were put on a ship and told to get on board, and they ended up in Australia, mostly. So you can see where it peaks during the famine, from 1800 to 1860. You can see this huge peak. And all these graphs have a similarity, but the famine this is why it is such as I said before, it is such a watershed in Irish history, because it marks a period where a lot of disaffected people were forced to leave the country, and it has led this lingering resentment both in Ireland and abroad about the behaviour of the English government. Okay, Don. And here we have what we call an assisted settlement. And this is a man called George Vesey Stewart, who, I'm trying to make a few shillings here in this country, decided his fortune was somewhere else, and he went off to New Zealand and bought land and became quite an important person in the development of that part of New Zealand, Kitty Catty, I think it's called. And this was in the late 19th century. It obtained a further 10,000 acres, adjoining what he already had. And again, the people came out 3 years later on the Lady Jocelyn. And among Stuart's passengers were his brother Hugh and Hugh's wife, Adele. So these people were immigrating to advance themselves economically. They were not the victims of the famine. They were probably quite well to do when they were leaving, but they felt that the potential for making more money was somewhere else. In this case, New Zealand. Okay. Now, there was some immigration by Irish people to South America, and in particular to Argentina and Uruguay. And those of you who are followers of the World Cup will know that there was a guy playing for Argentina with a local name, McAllister, and his ancestors came from here. So one of the interesting things about Argentina is that the people who are descended from these immigrants that went there are still very conscious of their Irish heritage. In fact, they started a hurling club in Buenos Aires, which is still in existence. They later turned to playing hockey, but they're back playing hurling again. And you know, as I said, their heritage has not been lost. They're still very conscious of their, and of course, then we have other figures that went to South America, like O'Higgins, who was important in the independence of Chile, and Brown, who was the head of the Argentinian Navy. And these are all descendants of immigrants, first generation immigrants. Okay, Don. So immigration didn't stop with the end of the 19th century, it continued through the 20th century. And I suggest that quite a few who are here tonight and maybe watching on Zoom are familiar with this because members of their family immigrated, including my own. And that was because right up until the 1970s, the employment opportunities were, shall we say, not brilliant. But that all stopped in the mid-1990s with the emergence of the Celtic Tiger. And we had what's known as reverse migration. People who had already immigrated decided to come back and settle in Ireland. And that, it just, again, it's another aspect of people, the movement of people. It isn't always one way, it can be both ways, in some cases involving the same people. So where are the Irish immigrants travel in the second half of the 20th century? And 3 out of 4 of them went to the UK. And the road network in the UK was largely built by Irish labourers and truck drivers and the like. It was handy. You could pop on a boat, you could be there overnight, and you could be standing in a queue for employment the next morning. A friend of mine who passed away some years ago, one of the nicest people I ever met was a man called Hugh McElvany from Monaghan. He immigrated in the 50s because he was the eldest of 7 children when he was 18. And when he got there, he joined the queue of casual labourers, and the lorry came along. If they had a need for people, you climbed aboard and off you went and did your day's work. So he was clever enough to understand how the system worked. He bought himself a lorry, and he started making money with that to the extent that he bought another lorry and then another one. And then he started buying and selling lorries and selling them back in Ireland. And eventually he ended up getting the exclusive agency for Scania trucks in Ireland. And if you are ever traveling to Dublin via Monaghan, it's that big place on the left-hand side. Now, he is, in my opinion, the perfect example of an Irish immigrant who did good. But he did good both in England and Ireland. And I think a man of very little education, but one of the most interesting people that I've had the privilege of ever meeting. And those of you who follow the GAA, his daughter's married to the manager of the Galway football team, Roy Joyce, his daughter Tracy. The nature of immigration then changed in the very late part of the 20th century, where people were immigrating out of choice, not of necessity. They were going for the experience of living in another country, experiencing other cultures. And they were taking with them a strong education so they could walk into well-paid jobs wherever they choose to make their destination. And that, I suppose, is the major difference in what little bit of immigration we have now with those of our forefathers. Right, John? And again, the clock turns, and here we have a family of East Timorese, people living in Dungannon with their Lithuanian or Russian neighbors. And we now are net immigrants. We don't have immigration anymore, we have immigration. And I would just add, when we were talking about that some people feel threatened by this. That these people are here, I've often heard the expression, they're taking our jobs. No, they're not. They're taking the jobs we don't want. And also, why should we treat these people the way our forefathers were treated when they emigrated to the UK or USA? You know, no dogs, no Irish, no blacks. You know, we can't be, we must remind ourselves that we're better than that. That these people are here to enrich the country, not to make it poorer. And very often what you find is, as my friend Michael Manny illustrates, is that people who emigrate are highly motivated people. They want to get on in life and they want to make money. And they are a bonus to the country rather than a minus quantity. So, folks, that's the experience of immigrants in USA and UK. But look at that figure on the right. 8 million people in 120 years left this country. 8 million people. More than the population of the country as it is at the minute. It's 7 million. So I read recently that if the famine had not happened, the population of Ireland would now be 36 million. Mind-boggling stuff, isn't it? But it's easy to say 8 million, but each one of those were human beings. Each one of those were our forefathers and mothers. And we should always remember that. We don't have to get all sentimental about it, but it is an important thing to remember. But the interesting thing is that the map on the left, the highest number of people immigrating, a percentage of immigrants into any country is Ireland. So we're net immigrants at the moment. And that's because the economy, particularly down south, is so strong and vibrant. And, you know, we should do well to remember that we have a duty to these people that have come to live here, that we don't treat them the way our forefathers were treated. That's basically all I want to say to you folks. Thank you very much for your attention. And I hope that those who joined us on Zoom, all 32 of you, or whatever it is, enjoyed the talk as much as I did giving it to you.